The city council meeting was at 7 p.m. By 8:30 p.m., Mayor Gerald Harmon was in an ambulance, 4 bullet wounds. His wife was still at the scene. She didn't run. She was sitting on the front steps of the house when the first patrol car arrived. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She had her hands in her lap, and she looked at the officers when they pulled up. She said 2 words before they cuffed her. He lied. That's it. That was her statement. I don't have a badge. I have documents. And what I pulled from the court filings, the banking records, the internal police reports, and the grand jury transcripts tells a story the local media buried inside a domestic dispute headline. This was not a domestic dispute. This was the end of a very long con. My name is Danny Cruz. I spent 12 years at the Miami Herald and the Tampa Bay Times. I covered corruption at the municipal level. I covered the kind of fraud that happens in the space between the city budget and the contractor invoice. I know what money laundering looks like when it's wearing a button-down shirt and a campaign smile. Gerald Harmon wore that shirt very well. Subscribe right now. And leave in the comments, do you think she was justified? Let me give you the backdrop. Harmon was the mayor of Crestfield, a mid-sized city of about 140,000 people in the inland South. Not a glamorous post, not a national name, but Crestfield had something valuable. A decade of infrastructure spending, new roads, a stadium renovation, a waterfront development project that cost $280 million and took 6 years. That kind of money, moving through a city that small, creates a lot of opportunity. Gerald Harmon understood opportunity. He had been mayor for 11 years. Before that, city council for 4 years. Before that, a real estate attorney with a practice that did a lot of work for municipal clients. He understood the machinery. He understood who signed what and when, and how long the paper trail took to surface in a public records request. He had built a career on that understanding. His public image was spotless. He coached youth baseball for years. He was active in his church. He and his wife Sandra had been married for 22 years. They had 2 adult children, a son in the military and a daughter in nursing school. The family appeared at every public event together. Sandra Harmon was known as a quiet woman, supportive. She worked part-time at a pediatric clinic as a medical assistant. She baked things for fundraisers. Nobody had ever heard her raise her voice. The official story, when it broke, was that Sandra had a breakdown, that the marriage had been under strain, that she suffered from anxiety and had become increasingly erratic. The Crestfield Courier ran that framing in its first 3 stories. None of it held up. Not when you look at the documents. Here is what Sandra Harmon actually found. And I want to be precise about the timeline because the sequence matters. Approximately 4 months before the shooting, Sandra Harmon was refinancing her personal vehicle. It was a routine process. She needed to pull their combined financial statements for the lender. Gerald handled all the family finances. He always had. Sandra had a joint checking account and a joint savings account, and she understood their household to be comfortable, but not extravagant. They owned their home outright. They had retirement accounts. Gerald had told her, repeatedly, that he was conservative with money, that they didn't have a lot of liquidity, but they were secure. When she pulled the financial documents, she found accounts she had never seen. Not in her name, not in their joint names. 3 separate accounts at 2 different institutions, one of them an out-of-state credit union she had never heard of. Combined balance across those 3 accounts, $1.4 million. She didn't confront him immediately. That is one of the most significant details in this story. She waited. She started looking. She had a brother-in-law who worked in insurance and understood financial documents, and she brought him copies of what she'd found without telling him where they came from. He told her the account structures were consistent with what he'd seen in fraud cases. Multiple small-dollar deposits made regularly, below the reporting threshold. The accounts had been active for at least 7 years. Sandra then hired a private investigator. She paid for it out of a personal savings account Gerald didn't know she had. That account had $18,000 in it. She had been quietly setting money aside for 11 years. That tells you something about the state of that marriage. The private investigator worked for 6 weeks. What he surfaced went beyond the accounts. Gerald Harmon had a second phone. He had been in a relationship with a woman named Patricia Odom for approximately 9 years. Patricia Odom lived in a condominium in a neighboring county. Gerald had been paying her rent since 2015. Patricia Odom also received periodic cash transfers. not small ones. The investigator documented $340,000 in traceable transfers over 7 years. That money had to come from somewhere. The PI flagged it. Sandra flagged it. And when you cross-reference the timing of those transfers with the Crestfield City contracts, the pattern is clear. I'm not using the word allegedly here. The documents say what they say. Between 2016 and 2022, a construction management firm called Hartwell and Breck received $47 million in Crestfield contracts, most of it waterfront development. Hartwell and Breck was owned by a holding company. That holding company had a managing partner who was listed in state business filings. Gerald Harmon's name was not on those filings, but a shell entity tied to one of his hidden accounts received annual consulting fees from the holding company, totaling, over 6 years, approximately $2.1 million. This is the structure. A city signs a contract with a vendor. The vendor pays a consulting fee to a shell entity. The shell entity deposits money into accounts that the public official controls, but that don't appear in any disclosure. The official story is a lie. Here's what the documents actually say. Gerald Harmon had been stealing from Crestfield for at least 7 years. The money went 2 places. Some of it stayed in accounts. Some of it went to Patricia Odom and the life they were maintaining in parallel. Now, what did Sandra do with this? She spent 4 months assembling documentation. She kept a physical binder, the PI's reports, the bank statements, the business filings she had pulled herself using public records requests. She had flagged the shell entity connection. She had printed the consulting fee schedules. She had mapped the transfers to Patricia Odom against the contract award dates. This was not a woman in a breakdown. This was a woman who had built a case. The night of November 14th, Gerald Harmon came home from the city council meeting at approximately 8:10 p.m. The meeting had ended early. Sandra was in the kitchen. According to the initial police report, there was a verbal confrontation. Sandra confronted him with the documents. Gerald's response, according to Sandra's subsequent statement to her attorney, was to tell her that she didn't understand what she was looking at and that she should put it away. She didn't put it away. The confrontation escalated. What happened in the next 20 minutes is documented in the 911 call, in Gerald Harmon's hospital intake statement, and in the physical evidence report from the scene. Sandra Harmon retrieved a .38 caliber revolver from a locked box in the bedroom closet. The gun was legally registered in her name. She had purchased it 3 years earlier. She had a concealed carry permit. She fired 5 shots, 4 connected. Gerald Harmon was struck once in the right shoulder, once in the right side, once in the upper left leg, and once in the left forearm. None of the wounds were immediately life-threatening, but he lost significant blood before the ambulance arrived. He was in surgery for 4 hours. She did not flee. She walked to the front steps, sat down, and called 911 herself. The recording is in the court record. Her voice is flat. She says there has been a shooting at her address. She gives the address. She says her husband needs an ambulance. She says she will be outside. She does not say she is sorry. She does not say it was an accident. When the first officer arrived, she was sitting where she said she would be. The officer's body camera footage shows her looking up when the car pulled in. She did not resist. She put her hands out before they asked. Gerald Harmon survived. He was in the hospital for 11 days. When investigators came to take his statement, he did not initially disclose the financial accounts. He told them it was a domestic incident. He said his wife had been struggling with her mental health. He said he didn't understand why she did it. They killed the story. I kept the files. Now you're watching what they didn't want published. Because here is where the official timeline becomes deliberately misleading. The Crestfield Police Department's initial public statement described the incident as a domestic dispute. No mention of documents, no mention of financial accounts. The department's lead detective, whose name appears in the incident report, was a man who had received a commendation signed by Gerald Harmon 3 years prior. That's not an accusation. That's a fact in a public record. Draw your own conclusions about the pace of the initial investigation. Sandra's attorney entered the financial documents into discovery within weeks of her arraignment. That is when things began to move. The DA's office, which was a county office rather than a city office, opened a parallel inquiry into Harmon's finances. Within 60 days, the state attorney's office had been notified. Within 90 days, the FBI field office in the region had opened a preliminary review. Gerald Harmon resigned from the mayor's office in January, approximately 10 weeks after the shooting. His resignation letter cited his health and his need to focus on his family. He did not acknowledge any wrongdoing. Sandra Harmon was charged with 4 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and 1 count of attempted murder. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense team was specific and methodical. They did not go with a crime of passion argument. They did not argue that she was mentally impaired. They argued that she had spent 4 months gathering evidence of criminal conduct and that the shooting occurred during a confrontation in which she reasonably believed she was in physical danger. They pointed to text messages from Gerald's secondary phone recovered by investigators that included 2 messages to an unknown recipient describing Sandra in terms that the defense characterized as threatening. I have read those messages. The defense's characterization was not a stretch. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the physical evidence: 4 bullet wounds, a legally owned weapon, a woman who showed no remorse at the scene, and minimal visible distress throughout the proceedings. The prosecution argued she had planned it. They cited the time between when she first found the accounts and when she shot him, 4 months. They said she had used those months to build her justification in her own mind. The defense called the PI. They called the brother-in-law. They called a forensic accountant who walked the jury through the shell entity structure, the consulting fees, and the transfers to Patricia Odom. They put the binder into evidence, all 340 pages of it. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They came back with a verdict of not guilty on the attempted murder charge. On the 4 counts of aggravated assault, they split: 2 guilty, 2 not guilty. The jury had hung on the 2 charges tied to the shoulder and arm wounds and reached conviction on the wounds to the side and leg. The judge, in sentencing, applied the minimum under the guidelines and credited time served. Sandra Harmon served 14 months. Gerald Harmon's legal situation was separate and ongoing. The federal inquiry that had been opened during Sandra's trial continued well after her release. Approximately 22 months after the shooting, he was indicted on 7 federal counts: wire fraud, bribery, conspiracy to defraud a municipality, and money laundering. He entered a guilty plea on 3 counts as part of a negotiated agreement. He was sentenced to 51 months in federal prison and ordered to pay $1.9 million in restitution. Patricia Odom was not charged. She cooperated with federal investigators. In exchange, she received immunity. Her testimony established that she had known Gerald was married, but had not known the specific source of the funds he used to support her. The investigators found her account credible. I'm not in a position to assess that determination from where I sit, but the immunity agreement is in the public record. Here is what the official narrative never addressed, and what the local coverage in Crestfield almost entirely ignored. The $2.1 million in consulting fees represented only what investigators could trace through existing bank records. The shell entity had been active longer than the 7-year window they audited. There were years prior to 2015 for which records were either unavailable or had not been requested. The federal indictment specifically noted that the documented conduct was not necessarily the full scope of the scheme, which means the number is likely higher, which means the years are likely more, which means Crestfield's residents funded not just Gerald Harmon's hidden savings, but a second life, a hidden relationship, and a structure sophisticated enough that it took a PI and a forensic accountant and a 4-month investigation by his own wife to start pulling it apart. The city's own finance department never flagged it. The city's auditor, who files annual reports, never flagged it. The state oversight body that reviews municipal contracts never flagged it. That is the part that should concern you more than the shooting. A man embedded in city government for 15 years built a fraud operation that no institutional check caught. Sandra caught it. She caught it accidentally, pulling documents for a car refinance. I don't say that to justify what she did in that kitchen. That's for you to weigh. The jury weighed it. They landed somewhere complicated, and I think that complication is honest. What I'm telling you is that the question of whether Gerald Harmon is a victim in this story is a question worth asking out loud, because the city of Crestfield is very much a victim, and the Crestfield Courier's first 3 stories did not mention the word fraud once. Sandra Harmon, as of the most recent public record I was able to locate, is working again. She lives in a different city. She does not give interviews. Her daughter, the one in nursing school at the time of the shooting, has since graduated and is working. Her son completed his military service. They have not made public statements. Gerald Harmon served 38 months of his 51-month sentence and was released on supervised release. He is prohibited from holding public office. The conditions of his supervised release include financial monitoring. The condominium where Patricia Odom lived was sold. The waterfront development project in Crestfield was eventually completed under new oversight. Whether the money that moved through Hartwell and Breck was fully accounted for in the federal restitution order, I cannot say with certainty. The restitution figure in the plea agreement was $1.9 million. The contracts totaled $47 million. The math is not comforting. I've been doing this work for a long time. I covered City Hall beats in 2 major markets. I know how these structures operate. The Gerald Harmon case is not exceptional in its design. The shell entities, the consulting fees, the below-threshold deposits, the parallel life funded by public money, these are not novel. What is unusual is that it surfaced. And it surfaced because a woman pulled a financial statement to refinance a car and found something that didn't add up. Most of the time, nobody pulls that statement. Most of the time, the auditor files the report and nobody reads it closely. Most of the time, the contractor gets the contract and the consulting fee gets paid and the accounts accumulate and the family at the public events looks exactly like what they're supposed to look like. Gerald Harmon looked like a mayor. He coached baseball, he shook hands, he signed commendations, he gave speeches about fiscal responsibility. I have video of him giving a speech at a city budget meeting in 2019 about the importance of transparency in public spending. That video is public record. It is freely available. I watched it twice. The official story is a lie. Here's what the documents actually say. A man in a position of public trust spent at minimum 7 years defrauding the residents of his city. He maintained a parallel relationship funded by that fraud. He was caught not by any institutional mechanism, but by his wife, who then spent 4 months building the documentation before the confrontation that ended in a hospital and a courtroom. And the initial media framing was domestic dispute. That framing is a choice. It is never an accident when the framing makes the institution look functional. It is always worth asking who benefits from the simpler story. I don't have a badge, I have documents, and those documents say what they say. If you found this useful, subscribe. There are more of these. There are always more of these. The files don't stop. And leave in the comments, do you think she was justified? I'm not asking rhetorically. People disagree on this one, and I want to know where you land.